Hollywood likes to pretend that every action movie is born from creativity, courage, and a bigger-than-life vision. Explosions light up the screen, heroes outrun death and villains, fall in slow motion as orchestras roar in the background. But behind all that cinematic chaos lies something far more dangerous than any stunt, any crash, any runaway car, the legal minefield that studios tiptoe through just to bring these blockbusters to life. Because the truth is simple, every time you saw a skyscraper blow apart, every time a character uncannily resembled a real person, every time a plot looked a little too familiar, someone somewhere was preparing to sue. Many of Hollywood's most iconic action films weren't just risky on set. They were risky in courtrooms. Some borrowed real events without permission. Others copied storylines from struggling writers who didn't have the power to fight back. A few portrayed real organizations, real criminals, or real victims so closely that studios had to assemble legal teams before the first trailer even dropped. And more than once a movie you loved only stayed in theaters because somebody quietly, secretly was paid to stay silent. What most audiences never realize is that these films were inches away from being shut down, delayed, re-edited, or dragged into multi-million-dollar lawsuits that could have destroyed entire studios. Critics reviewed the action. Fans cheered the spectacle. But behind the velvet curtain, lawyers were battling over identity rights, copyright theft, libel, misappropriation of real stories, and accusations of idea lifting that came from people Hollywood hoped would never speak up. Tonight, we're opening the files they hoped you'd never see. These are the action movies that weren't just explosive on screen, they were explosive in the legal shadows too. Are you ready for the stories that nearly blew up Hollywood from the inside? Fact 1, Die Hard 1988, when Die Hard exploded into theaters, audiences saw a lone cop battling terrorists inside a Los Angeles skyscraper. What they didn't see was the legal chaos brewing underneath chaos that began long before the film even went into production. The movie was based on the novel Nothing Lasts Forever by Roderick Thor, but the studio's early drafts drifted so far from the book that the author's representatives began preparing a major copyright claim. The initial script transformed key plot points, softened character motivations, and introduced entirely new narrative arcs that risked violating the original contract. Even worse, the studio's decision to use the Nakatomi Plaza, an actual corporate building, triggered a dispute over the building's depiction. Executives feared the film's storyline centered on a terrorist attack could damage their public image. Behind the scenes, lawyers negotiated frantic agreements to ensure the building's owners would not sue for defamation or emotional distress if the film sparked negative associations. But the most dangerous threat came from a real-life counter-terrorism group that claimed the movie's portrayal of international criminals closely mirrored classified profiles they had developed. Their complaint alleged that someone inside the organization had leaked sensitive information that ended up shaping the villains in the film. If proven true, this would have implicated both the studio and several consultants on set. To prevent the meltdown, the studio quietly rewrote several antagonist details in the final weeks of production, changing backgrounds, motivations, and even accents to avoid a catastrophic federal-level legal battle. The public never heard about this dispute, but insiders still whisper about the redacted binder, a set of notes that legal teams forced writers to destroy after final revisions. Die Hard became a genre-defining classic. But it only survived because an army of lawyers fought to keep it alive, proof that the biggest explosions weren't on screen, but in the boardrooms that almost shut the film down. Fact 2. The Terminator 1984, before the Terminator rewrote the rules of sci-fi action. It triggered one of Hollywood's most delicate plagiarism disputes, one that nearly erased the film from existence. Shortly after the movie's release, multiple writers came forward claiming that James Cameron's story bore uncanny similarities to earlier works involving time-traveling assassins and cybernetic hunters. The loudest voice belonged to a well-known television creator whose old anthology episodes featured machines sent back in time to eliminate key human targets. His legal team argued that the Terminator lifted not just themes but entire narrative frameworks, including the unstoppable hunter archetype and the paradox-driven structure. Studio attorneys panicked. If the lawsuit went to court, it could freeze distribution block home video rights and sink the movie during its rise to cult status. So, behind closed doors, the studio negotiated a quiet settlement. The TV creator received financial compensation and was granted a retroactive, inspired by credit that appeared in later releases, an addition casual viewers rarely noticed, but legal scholars still discuss today. But the most explosive claim came from an independent sci-fi writer who insisted Cameron had read his unpublished manuscript during a pitch meeting years earlier. He alleged the studio borrowed his antagonist, a relentless metallic assassin with human skin. The studio's legal team fought this aggressively, denying access, knowledge, and influence. The writer eventually backed down, but only after signing a strict NDA that barred him from publicly discussing the case. Insiders say the settlement was substantial enough that he never worked in Hollywood again. If the disputes hadn't been buried so quickly, The Terminator might have been remembered not as a classic, but as the center of a copyright war that redefined creative boundaries in Hollywood. Fact 3. Speed 1,994 on the surface speed was a high-octane thrill ride about a bomb-rigged bus barreling through Los Angeles. Beneath that engine roar, though, lay a legal story that threatened to derail the film long before the public ever heard the word Kino. The movie was accused of borrowing heavily from a 1985 Japanese action film about a runaway vehicle strapped with explosives, as well as from a spec script circulating through agencies in the early 90s essay that featured a nearly identical setup, a public transport. Hostage scenario, a taunting bomber, and a hero forced to improvise under impossible pressure. When the film's trailer dropped, the writer of that spec script immediately recognized multiple sequences, some nearly line for line from his unpublished draft. He lawyered up, preparing a copyright infringement case that could have halted the movie's release. The studio's legal team scrambled, combing through old submissions and agency logs to prove the filmmakers never had access to his work. But they hit a problem. A junior development assistant admitted off the record that she had read his script and placed it in a similar concepts folder used during early brainstorming sessions. The studio reacted fast. They flew the writer out, offered him compensation, and insisted on a confidentiality clause, so airtight it reportedly included restrictions on public interviews, writing workshops, and even podcast appearances. The Japanese studio behind the earlier film also raised concerns, threatening a parallel lawsuit over unauthorized creative adaptation. To avoid an international legal mess, Speed's creative team altered several technical details, reshot minor scenes, and edited certain sequences in ways that made the final cut distinct enough to deflect further claims. The result? A blockbuster hit that nearly blew up not because of a bomb on a bus, but because too many people believed the movie shouldn't legally exist in the first place. Fact 4. Predator 1987. What began as a jungle-set survival thriller quietly evolved into one of Hollywood's most heated authorship disputes. Predator was promoted as an original idea, a deadly extraterrestrial hunter stalking an elite commando team, but deep inside the Writers Guild archives, a nearly forgotten script had been gathering dust since the late 70s. That earlier script, written by a pair of sci-fi enthusiasts, told the story of soldiers in hostile terrain being hunted by an unseen, technologically superior creature. When Predator became a hit, those writers immediately recognized disturbing parallels, identical beats, similar kills, even the same invisible enemy concept. They approached the studio privately at first, but the response was evasive emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed and legal counsels urged silence. Eventually, their attorney issued a formal notice.
Suddenly, the studio shifted from dismissive to panicked.
Executives feared the writers had enough evidence to prove that someone in development had accessed their script during the early 80s. The studio initiated a shadow investigation tracking script submissions agency records and internal memos. They discovered that a producer tied to the film had in fact received the older draft years earlier. If that information reached the press, Predator's reputation as a groundbreaking original could collapse. To bury the risk, the studio arranged a quiet settlement, undisclosed, sealed, and locked behind multiple NDAs. Insiders claimed the amount was so substantial that the original writers abandoned Hollywood entirely, choosing anonymity over a prolonged legal war. Meanwhile, the production team was instructed never to acknowledge the incident, publicly creating one of the most whispered about borrowed concept scandals in action movie history. Fact 5, The Bourne Identity, 2002. Fact 5, The Bourne Identity, 2002, though based on Robert Ludlum's best-selling novel, The Bourne Identity carried a legal shadow. No one expected the accusation that the film misappropriated classified counterintelligence techniques belonging to a former intelligence contractor. Months before its release, a private security consultant contacted the studio claiming that several spy tactics featured in the movie Safe House procedures, covert exit strategies, and the psychological conditioning described in the Treadstone program were nearly identical to methods used in off-the-books operations he had designed for government agencies. His argument was bold. The movie revealed techniques that were never meant for public consumption. What startled the studio was the consultant's evidence. He produced internal memos and operational manuals showing uncanny overlaps with specific scenes, including a takedown sequence that mirrored a training exercise he had architected. If true, the film risked violating federal secrecy agreements and could expose the studio to major liability. The legal team scrambled to determine whether a scriptwriter or consultant had unauthorized contact with the contractor. They found nothing conclusive, yet the similarities were difficult to dismiss. Behind the scenes, the studio entered discreet negotiations. Sources say the consultant demanded credit or compensation. The studio refused, both unwilling to acknowledge any real-world influence. Eventually, a private settlement was reached, sealed under a confidentiality clause so severe that even referencing the dispute could trigger legal consequences. The studio made minor edits to the final cut, toning down terminology and modifying tactical descriptions. Viewers never noticed, but the government certainly did. To this day, some analysts believe the film's depiction of covert programs was uncomfortably accurate and that the legal conflict was much closer to a national security breach than Hollywood ever admitted. Fact 6, Lethal Weapon 2 1989. Lethal Weapon 2 pushed the buddy cop formula into explosive territory, but behind its humor and chaos lay a storm of international legal threats. The film's portrayal of South African diplomats using apartheid-era immunity to conduct criminal operations infuriated multiple political groups, activists, and even real former officials who believed the movie dangerously caricatured them. Several individuals claimed that certain characters resembled them too closely, down to mannerisms, accents, and personal histories. Their lawyers drafted defamation suits asserting that the film implied they were complicit in corruption or violence. While the studio publicly framed the film as fiction, executives privately panicked. If any plaintiff could prove recognizable likeness or intentional malice, worldwide distribution could be jeopardized. The South African government, still under apartheid at the time, also considered diplomatic action, arguing that the movie damaged its global reputation. Though they never filed formal complaints, behind-the-scene communications between embassy officials and studio lawyers were tense and heated. Complicating matters further, a South African screenwriter alleged the film borrowed from his unpublished manuscript criticizing political abuse under diplomatic cover. He claimed that his documents sent to a Los Angeles agency years earlier had been copied and retooled into Lethal Weapon 2's storyline. The studio denied all accusations, but their legal advisors insisted on quiet, preemptive damage control. Settlements were reached, activist groups received donations, and certain international versions of the film were edited to soften depictions of political entities. The movie went on to become a blockbuster, but insiders say the real action took place in conference rooms where lawyers worked overtime to prevent a geopolitical backlash that could have turned a buddy cop sequel into a global legal nightmare. Fact 7 True Lies 1994 behind its massive stunts and high-energy spectacle. True Lies was entangled in one of the most volatile legal disputes ever tied to an action film, accusations of cultural defamation and unauthorized character appropriation. The movie's portrayal of a Middle Eastern terrorist organization ignited outrage among multiple advocacy groups who argued that the film recycled harmful stereotypes that could be traced back to real individuals and real political factions. But the true legal danger came from a small Middle Eastern community in California, whose leaders claimed several characters, particularly the villainous mastermind, were modeled after real activists who had never been involved in violence of any kind. Their argument was simple: the film blurred fiction and reality to the point where it falsely implicated them in terrorism. Lawyers for the community drafted a defamation suit warning the studio that the character's name, accent, and ideological motivations closely matched those of a known political speaker living in the U.S. They demanded removal, renaming, or an official disclaimer. Studio attorneys initially dismissed the claim until private investigators confirmed that one of the film's consultants had indeed attended lectures by the activist in question. That connection was enough to turn a weak complaint into a potentially devastating lawsuit. To avoid litigation, the studio made rapid changes in post-production, altering voice lines, editing specific details from the script, and reworking promotional materials for certain regions. Additionally, the studio discreetly funded cultural outreach programs as part of a behind-the-scenes settlement. Insiders claim that one clause required the activists to never publicly acknowledge the dispute. In the end, True Lies thrived as an action comedy classic, but only after escaping a real-life political firestorm that could have buried the film beneath years of legal warfare. Fact 8, The Rock 1996, when The Rock premiered, audiences embraced its wild plot about rogue Marines seizing Alcatraz and threatening San Francisco with chemical weapons. But buried beneath the explosions was a legal battle involving a real former military chemist who insisted that the movie's depiction of VX gas storage protocols and rapid deployment units mirrored classified procedures he had personally developed for the government. The man claimed that the film portrayed techniques, terminology, and emergency response structures not available in public documents, suggesting that someone in production had illegally accessed restricted information. This allegation terrified the studio. If the government believed national security secrets were leaked, the film could face federal investigation, pulled distribution, or worse, criminal charges for consultants or writers. Quiet meetings were held between studio representatives and military officials to determine whether any classified knowledge had been compromised. Although the Pentagon publicly dismissed the scenario, insiders say that several technical advisors were questioned and later removed from subsequent Hollywood projects. The chemist's second claim was even more explosive, that the protagonist's backstory was based directly on his own life. He alleged that the film appropriated his research contributions, his strained relationship with government departments, and even a specific incident involving withheld recognition. He demanded significant compensation and credit, rather than risk a trial that could force the studio to disclose internal notes, communications, and consultant interactions. Lawyers reached a confidential settlement. As part of the agreement, the chemist's public statements were tightly restricted. To avoid further scrutiny, the studio altered all official materials to emphasize that the film was entirely fictional and made last-minute edits to technical explanations of VX gas. Audiences never noticed, but inside Hollywood's legal circles, The Rock is still cited as the action film that came dangerously close to triggering a federal security scandal. Fact: 9-Point Break 1991. The adrenaline-soaked heist surfing thriller Point Break didn't just break bones on set, it nearly broke the studio in court. Shortly after release, a former FBI trainee came forward claiming that the film's depiction of undercover infiltration techniques, surfer subcultures linked to organized theft, and specific procedural methods used during stakeouts were directly inspired by a thesis he had written during training. According to him, a copy of his thesis had circulated among script consultants before being woven into the movie's narrative. If true, the studio might have violated not only intellectual property laws, but also federal confidentiality agreements tied to FBI training materials. At the same time, a group of professional surfers threatened a separate lawsuit. They argued that the film's portrayal of surfers as criminals, bank robbers, thrill-seeking anarchists, and violent extremists was defamatory and damaged the livelihood of real surf instructors and organizations. Their legal claim suggested that the film used specific cultural elements associated with real surf communities without permission and exaggerated them in ways that painted entire groups as dangerous. Studio executives dismissed the complaint at first until lawyers discovered that one of the film's surf culture consultants had been a disgruntled former instructor with personal grudges against several real organizations. This connection amplified the defamation risk substantially. To prevent a legal avalanche, the studio launched a behind-the-scenes negotiation campaign. The former FBI trainee was offered a private settlement rumored to include a significant payment and an NDA preventing him from discussing his training program publicly. Surf groups were appeased with sponsorship donations and public relations efforts, quietly funded by the studio. Some international cuts of the film even softened dialogue referring to surfers as criminals. In the end, Point Break became a beloved cult classic. But behind that legacy lies a trail of sealed documents, silenced consultants, and a studio that had to fight wave after wave of legal threats just to keep the movie afloat. Fact 10, The Matrix 1999, as The Matrix reshaped action cinema with its cyber reality, bullet time, and philosophical dystopia. It also walked straight into one of Hollywood's most notorious authorship controversies. Soon after the film premiered, an independent writer claimed that the core premise, world-building concepts, and even character archetypes mirrored her long-form manuscript that had been circulating among studios years earlier. Her lawyers argued that the film's narrative humanity trapped inside a simulated world controlled by machines reflected ideas and structures that only someone with direct access to her unpublished work could have known. The studio dismissed the allegations as coincidence, but the situation grew dangerous fast. Investigators uncovered that a junior script reader had indeed reviewed her manuscript during a development cycle. Although there was no proof that the Wachowskis had seen the document, the mere existence of an internal coverage report created enough overlap to make litigation risky. The writer filed a lawsuit seeking massive damages, arguing that her intellectual property had been mined without credit or compensation. Behind closed doors, the studio assembled what insiders called a black ops legal team specialists in derivative content defense. They aimed to prove that the film's influences were drawn from cyberpunk literature, philosophy, and anime rather than any single source. Still, the risk of a public trial exposing internal memos and development histories was too great. A confidential settlement was negotiated with terms so restrictive that the writer effectively vanished from public view afterward. Meanwhile, the studio altered certain materials in the film's extended universe, subtly distancing the franchise from elements that too closely resembled her manuscript. In legal circles, The Matrix is still whispered about as the blockbuster that nearly detonated under the weight of its own ideas that some believe weren't entirely its own. Fact 11 Top Gun 1986 Top Gun sent Navy recruitment numbers soaring, but it also generated one of the most delicate legal challenges involving real individuals portrayed in an action film. Years after release, the family of an actual naval aviator claimed that Maverick's characterization drew heavily from their relative, a charismatic but troubled pilot who died under controversial circumstances. They pointed out similarities in personality, backstory, and even a once classified incident that appeared to inspire one of the film's major emotional beats. Their claim accused the studio of exploiting their loved one's life without permission, effectively turning private tragedy into mass entertainment. A second legal threat emerged from a journalist who had written an investigative article on fighter pilot culture. He insisted that the film borrowed not just themes from his work, but specific anecdotes, slang, and real operational details that he had uncovered through confidential interviews. Some of those interview subjects later claimed they never consented to having their stories fictionalized. If any of those claims held up in court, the film risked violating rights of publicity and privacy. Behind the scenes, the Navy stepped in not to support the lawsuits, but to prevent sensitive information from becoming part of a public trial. Meetings with studio executives resulted in coordinated strategies to avoid litigation altogether. Settlements were quietly arranged with the journalist and the pilot's family, accompanied by NAs limiting their ability to discuss the case. Some elements of Top Gun's script were retroactively attributed to official military input to obscure the origin of certain details. The film soared to iconic status, but insiders know that it nearly collided with legal turbulence, fierce enough to force a grounding proof that even Hollywood's most glamorous jets fly dangerously close to real lives and real secrets. Fact 12 Bad Boys. 2003, behind its explosive car chases, outrageous shootouts, and hyper-stylized chaos Bad Boys. I sparked a legal battle with Miami residents and independent filmmakers who believed the movie crossed serious ethical and legal boundaries. Multiple homeowners complained that production damaged private property during action sequences, including a high-speed chase filmed near residential zones. Several residents asserted that the studio went beyond permitted locations using adjacent areas without authorization and causing destruction that was never fully compensated. Threats of a collective lawsuit surfaced as soon as filming wrapped. But the more dangerous allegation came from a small group of independent directors who claimed that the film borrowed heavily from a low-budget action project they had pitched years earlier. Their script centered around a reckless police duo navigating corruption and narcotics raids in Florida, complete with a chaotic highway chase involving unsecured cargo, strikingly similar to the film's memorable freeway set piece. They argued that their pitch package contained storyboard sequences that predated Bad Boys, i.e., its production notes, and shared uncanny similarities in pacing, staging, and character dynamic. The studio's legal team aggressively denied access, influence, or imitation. Yet, internal emails leaked years later suggested that a producer might have received the filmmaker's materials through an agency intermediary. The studio feared that if the case went public, it could expose a pattern of idea lifting within certain development pipelines. To seal the cracks, a substantial settlement was negotiated. The The independent filmmakers signed this, restricting them from ever publicly claiming involvement in the conceptual groundwork of Bad Boys. Meanwhile, the property damage complaints were resolved through a mix of quiet payouts and city-funded mediation. The studio avoided admission of wrongdoing, but local officials later pushed for stricter filming regulations, an indirect legacy of the chaos Bad Boys I left behind. It remains one of those films where the mayhem wasn't just the story, it was the legal reality unfolding just outside the camera frame. Fact 13, Rambo First Blood Part, 1985, while audiences were thrilled by Rambo's explosive return to the battlefield, the film ignited a storm of legal threats that few outside Hollywood ever heard about. The story's depiction of covert POW rescue missions in Southeast Asia drew immediate backlash from several veterans groups who argued that the movie misrepresented real operations and portrayed actual military figures through thinly veiled fictional counterparts. One retired officer claimed that the antagonist's role in American bureaucrats sabotaging rescue attempts was directly inspired by him pointing to shared biographical details and even a similar career trajectory. His legal team drafted a defamation suit, asserting that the character's cowardly decisions damaged his reputation within military circles. Simultaneously, a journalist who had spent years investigating the POW/MIA controversy alleged that the film borrowed heavily from confidential interviews and unpublished notes that had been shown to a producer during preliminary research. She insisted that key plot points, including the political interference, abandoned soldiers, and clandestine negotiations, mirrored her work too closely to be coincidence. If proven, the studio would face accusations of misappropriating investigative material protected by journalistic privilege. The situation escalated further when an overseas political organization argued that the film's portrayal of their country as a corrupt, oppressive force inflamed tensions and constituted cultural slander. They threatened diplomatic complaints unless the studio edited certain dialogue in international releases. In response, the studio launched a multi-level damage control campaign. Settlements were arranged with the veteran officer and the journalist, while alternate cuts of the film were quietly produced for specific markets. First Blood Part I became a box office phenomenon, but it survived only because the studio maneuvered through a minefield of legal, political, and ethical challenges, proof that Rambo wasn't the only one fighting battles during production. Fact 14, Mission Impossible, 2000, with John Woo's signature slow-motion mayhem and high-flying stunts. Mission Impossible. I dominated theaters, but behind the curtain, it triggered a labyrinth of legal shocks. The most serious claim came from a novelist who believed the movie mirrored the central premise of one of his books: a rogue operative, a weaponized biological threat, and a morally ambiguous pharmaceutical conspiracy. He presented a detailed comparison chart showing near-identical plot turns, character archetypes, and even a climactic betrayal resembling a crucial chapter in his novel. His accusation suggested that the studio had accessed his work through an agency submission years before production. While the studio denied any connection, internal inquiries revealed that one of the film's junior story editors had previously worked at the same agency the novelist used. That thin thread was enough to give the claim traction. Meanwhile, an Australian stunt organization raised concerns that production violated safety regulations during a motorcycle chase filmed on public roads. They alleged that several stunts bypassed local permitting laws, endangering both crew members and bystanders. If proven, the production could face not only fines but potential liability for negligence. The legal stakes deepened when a biotech company threatened action, arguing that the movie's fictional virus mirrored proprietary research documented in internal papers leaked during a corporate dispute. They accused the studio of sensationalizing their work and linking it to unethical experimentation. Although the claims seemed speculative, the studio feared discovery proceedings could expose confidential correspondence from across the production. Ultimately, multiple settlements, each protected by NS, kept the film's release on track. Minor story adjustments were made late in post-production, particularly around the scientific terminology. Few viewers noticed, but insiders know Mission Impossible. I narrowly avoided its own impossible mission, surviving a three-front legal siege. Fact 15, face/off 1997, the surreal identity-swapping action thriller face/off dazzled audiences with its originality, but its premise sparked an authorship battle that nearly derailed the film. A medical researcher alleged that the movie's depiction of an experimental face transplant surgery echoed a confidential procedure he had proposed in a classified medical paper years earlier. He claimed the film revealed techniques, risks, and tissue adaptation concepts that were never public knowledge, making it impossible for the writers to have invented them independently. His legal team argued that someone with access to his restricted documents had served as an uncredited consultant, breaching confidentiality agreements tied to military medical contracts. At the same time, an aspiring screenwriter came forward claiming that the film's core hook, two mortal enemies swapping identities, originated in a spec script he had submitted to multiple studios in the late '80s. He provided time-stamped drafts showing similar plot beats, including the villain impersonating the hero within his own family. Although the film's team claimed independent creation, leaked production memos suggested that some executives had indeed reviewed concept submissions involving identity inversion thrillers. Fearing a courtroom battle that would drag medical ethics and Hollywood development practices into the spotlight, the studio quietly negotiated behind closed doors. The researcher received a settlement that reportedly restricted him from publishing future work related to surgical identity alteration. The screenwriter's claim was resolved with a lump sum payment and a strict NDA. Even after its release, the film attracted scrutiny from legal scholars who questioned how certain medical details made it into the script. For the studio, the biggest stunt wasn't the action, it was keeping the lawsuits from swapping their blockbuster for a full-blown disaster. Bonus fact, The Dark Knight 2008, long before The Dark Knight became a cultural phenomenon. It triggered one of the most quietly explosive legal conflicts ever attached to an action film, and one the studio buried so effectively that most of the public still has no idea it happened. The controversy centered around the Joker, specifically Heath Ledger's unsettling interpretation. Shortly after the film wrapped production, the family of a real-life performance artist contacted the studio claiming that Ledger's Joker bore a striking, unmistakable resemblance to their late relative's stage persona, chaotic street performances, distorted makeup, nihilistic monologues, and even a chilling, lopsided grin captured in a series of underground recordings never released publicly. Their claim went far beyond aesthetic similarities. They argued that the character's philosophy, gestures, and vocal cadence mirrored the artist's private video diaries, videos that had never been published, but had circulated among a small circle of avant-garde filmmakers. According to their attorney, one of those filmmakers had briefly consulted on early Joker concept art. If true, this would mean that the film appropriated an identity without permission, turning a deeply personal, mentally fragile performance into a blockbuster villain. The studio panicked. A public lawsuit would fuel sensational headlines, tying the Joker to a troubled artist's tragic life, overshadowing the film and potentially damaging Ledger's legacy. The legal team moved fast, requesting sealed meetings with the family. Insiders claim the family presented a devastating piece of evidence, an archived recording in which the artist performed a monologue with phrasing eerily similar to one of the Joker's most iconic lines. Whether coincidence or influence, it was enough to threaten the film's release. To silence the dispute, the studio offered the family a confidential settlement reportedly tied to a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. They also altered marketing materials, toning down certain visual motifs and emphasizing that Ledger constructed the character independently. The entire affair vanished from public record, buried as if it had never happened. Today, The Dark Knight is remembered for its brilliance. Almost no one knows how close it came to being dragged into a legal inferno that would rewritten its legacy forever. Hollywood has always tried to convince audiences that what happens behind the scenes is nothing more than creative magic writers with wild imaginations, directors with bold visions, and actors who bring it all to life. But as you've just seen, the truth is far more complicated. Many of the greatest action films ever made only survived because lawyers worked in the shadows, sealing settlements, rewriting histories, and burying the stories the studios never wanted you to hear. And these weren't isolated incidents. There are still files, hundreds of them, sitting in vaults, locked behind non-disclosure agreements, and redacted documents waiting for the day someone lets a little light slip through the cracks. If you want me to keep opening those vaults, if you want more secrets from the corners of Hollywood they hope you'll never notice, you already know what to do. Just say the word and we'll pull back the velvet curtain again.